Let's see what the chat says about my technique. Oh, Papa Squats found a TikTok for us. I love you, Papa Squats. This is why you're goated. Oh, it's History Wizard. Boo! A boo! I don't like the History Wizard. They have me blocked. They have me blocked literally for, like, giving them my opinion on Korea. Like, their argument against Korea was so nonsensical. I asked the History Wizard, this person, I said, have you seen Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang? Which is a movie about how propaganda is generated surrounding North Korea. And he said, I've seen the propaganda, yes. And I said, oh, you think the movie's propaganda? What about the movie is propaganda? I'll show you the movie. It's on YouTube for free. Loyal Citizens of Pyongyang and Seoul. So he said, I asked him why this movie is propaganda. And he said, because the very fact that the movie doesn't start from the assumption that North Korea is a human rights abusing atrocity. That's what he said. He said it's propaganda because the movie doesn't start from the assumption that North Korea is just a comic book villain. And I mean, if that doesn't show how American hegemony and the lies and narratives of American imperialism and the hegemony, the dominance of American capitalist imperialist ideas influences and infects the minds of historians, of academics, of everybody in this country, I don't know what is a good example of that. You know, that's such a good example. This person considers himself a historian, but he considers anything to be propaganda which doesn't start from the assumption that North Korea is basically a comic book villain, which is why the U.S. spends so much effort and money on this propaganda, because they benefit from our society thinking that America's enemies are comic book villains. So let's watch this one since I talked about it.
Because fascists lie. It's what they do. Authoritarian regimes love to capitalize on the anger, shame, and resentment of a disenfranchised working class and use that to instigate large-scale violent change. But they never have any intention of actually turning control of the means of production over to the workers or ensuring that those workers...
You don't just turn the means of production over to control of the workers. Because guess what, History Wizard? Guess what, genius? Before they started trying to transition to socialism, North Korea was basically a semi-feudal agrarian society, right? This is something that wealthy Americans like you cannot understand because you've always lived with the comforts of industrial society, but a lot of these countries weren't industrialized. China, similarly, was an agrarian peasant society. So they needed to industrialize themselves before they could create socialism, before they even had the means of production, which could give the possibility of communism. And in the case of North Korea, the U.S. bombed them to the point where they killed 20% of the North Korean population, and there wasn't a single building over 2 stories tall left standing. So they couldn't turn means of production over to the workers, because they didn't have means of production anymore. They all got bombed. So North Korea, since then, has had to develop themselves in various different ways, and they've created a mildly prosperous society, a society which functions much different from the U.S. If you want to hear more about it, please check out our podcast with Derek Ford of the Liberation School, who spent lots of time in both the North and the South and debunked a lot of these absurd myths being repeated by folks like the History Wizard. But they've been constructing a society that can function and that can feed its people, right? Since the horrific U.S. bombing campaign, they've done that in the face of the most stringent sanction campaign in history, other than the embargo that the U.S. keeps on Cuba, right? So they haven't been able to trade with much of the rest of the world. You know, China, of course, is their main partner because of this U.S. embargo. So the U.S., bombs all their infrastructure, places them under embargo, and then Korea, struggles to develop themselves. And this dude sitting in the U.S., the country that bombed them, this dude sitting within the comforts of industrial society goes, oh, why haven't you given the means of production to the workers yet? Why haven't you given the means of the production to the workers? You know, and if you listen to Derek Ford from the Liberation School, the workers know that they are developing, building up the means of production, and that they do share, they do share ownership in it. They have a system of agriculture based on collective farming. My Brothers and Sisters in the North is another great documentary which goes into the details of the collective farming systems in the North and the sort of profit sharing methods that are set up to try and transition towards socialism.
Workers have the better standard of living that they were promised at the beginning of the revolution.
Every single revolution, socialist revolution in history has brought about a far increased standard of living. You know 17% of the women in the USSR could read before the revolution, and something like less than 30% of the men. And within a few years, 99.9% of them could read. And I love Americans are like, oh, who cares about the literacy rates? Yeah, easy for you to say. You've always been able to read. You've always lived in a society where they just teach you how to read. Do you know what it means for a revolutionary government to make peasants literate when formerly they were illiterate? Taking their literacy away is a great way to control people. Which was largely happening in most of these agrarian peasant societies which have had socialist and communist revolutions, like China, Cuba, the DPRK, Vietnam, etc. They largely, the peasants and the subjugated masses were kept from being taught how to read because of how powerful reading is, because of how much information can be gleaned through reading. And Americans are so quick to dismiss things like that. Not to mention, the decreases in malnutrition, the decreases in poverty, the increases in shelter, decreases in homelessness that are brought about by these revolutions. In China, the first 10 years under Mao, after the revolution, yes, there were mistakes made, for sure. Yes, people died. But people were dying for hundreds of years before that due to famine, and the first 10 years after Mao were the fastest increase in life expectancy that had ever happened in human history. Ever. And you're going to sit here and be like, these revolutions said they were going to make life better, but, things have just got bad. I read it on CNN. CNN told me China bad. Okay, well, under Mao they had the fastest increase of life expectancy ever, and they industrialized their country, and they went from a feudal agrarian country to a country that eradicated relative poverty. So if you think that is bad, it's because you're privileged and you live in an industrial imperialist country.
The Nazis did it in Germany, Mao did it in China, Stalin did it in Russia, and the Kim family did it in North Korea.
And guess what? The Nazis, who were not actual socialists, and Hitler sold off all the state-owned industry, right? They'd crush labor unions. They killed communists, threw them in jail. Mussolini's black shirts were famous for this, as were Hitler's stormtroopers, for targeting left-wing actors and socialists. And, the standard of living didn't increase. People were just sent to war en masse by this madman Hitler. That is not what happened in the Soviet Union or China as I just described. Not even close.
The same song and dance every single time.
Not to mention the USSR killed Hitler. They defeated Hitler. Actually, Hitler eventually killed himself. But they fought the brunt of the war. And he goes, it's the same story every time. No, it's not. Liberals see the same story every time. I see a different story. When I look at the USSR, when I look at China, when I look at Vietnam, when I look at Cuba, there is a different material context every time. There are different elements. There are different actors. And if you read the academics and the debates that go on within China, instead of just reading whatever Western historians and Western news sources you read, History Wizard, if you read this debate, you see how much they've learned from the USSR, how much they learned from Vietnam, how much they learned from the DPRK, and they said, okay, this is what they did. Here's what worked, here's what didn't. So this is what we should go forward with. And here's what we should change based on our context, which is different from the context of the USSR. And this is how they've been able to eradicate poverty. Through looking at what failed in the past, what social experiments did right and what they did wrong. Including themselves, criticizing themselves. And then you have American liberal historians out here like, oh, it's the same story every time. Stalin, Fidel Castro, Mao, Hitler, they're all the same. Like, yeah, if you don't actually learn about what happened, I guess they can kind of seem like they were similar. If you only focus on the great men of history, if you only focus on the leaders of countries and their personality traits, which is how liberals analyze history, rather than looking at the material realities and looking at the different material struggles and complex situations existing in each country, if you ignore all that and just boil it down to these leaders and then project whatever personality traits onto these leaders that you want them to have, then yes, I guess all those countries seem the same, History Wizard.
Time.
You're not doing very good historical analysis, though. I gotta give you an F on that.
Communism doesn't actually turn fascist. Fascists just slap a thin veneer of workers' rights on top of their authoritarianism and use that to mobilize a vast army of angry peasants.
Read Black Shirts and Reds and shut up and stop making TikTok videos. Everything that the Nazis and Italians did was against the communists and against the socialists. Not everything, they were madmen with their own crazy ideas. But like I said, all the state-run industry they sold off, all the unions they crushed, all the socialists violently repressed by right-wing militias. The same thing that happened in Bolivia with the U.S. CIA-supported coup just 2 years ago. The same thing that happened in Chile when the U.S. supported the fascist Pinochet. They rounded up 20,000 socialists and had them murdered in the Chilean soccer stadium. Fascists know that socialists are the ones who are opposed to their ideology, diametrically opposed. And that is why fascists kill us socialists and not you liberals every time there's a fascist takeover or coming of power.
Because angry people want easy solutions. And at the end of the day, the easiest solution...
Easy solutions? Easy solutions? You're the one who just said it's all the same every single time. Right? Communism, fascism, Stalin, Mao, they're all the same. You're the one doing easy, dumb, half-baked analysis. You're the one taking the easy way out by not actually analyzing the concrete material conditions of these countries or the debate that goes on within these countries or the struggles that have gone on within these countries. You're the one who boils it all down to, there's no way the Chinese people could have constructed a society that they want, that the people like, that the people brought themselves out of poverty. No, it's all Mao. All those Chinese people, the millions and millions and millions of people, they're just following Mao. They're not smart enough to decide for themselves. Like, what a xenophobic, simple way of looking at the world and geopolitics for someone who calls themselves a historian.
The solution there is just kill everyone who stands in your way. Because...
No, you're talking about capitalist imperialism. I had a tweet the other day that said, capitalism kills everybody who tries to create an alternative economic system and then claims to be the only system that works. That is what capitalism does. Not communism, friend. Not at all.